I've got a couple of things to show. I'm going to show. So this time last year, I was in Portugal, um, and my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, it's actually kind of funny. They bought a condo in Ontario that wasn't finished on time, and they were suddenly homeless. So they figured, you know what, it's cheaper to live in Portugal than it is in Toronto. So they flew over to Portugal and rented a place there, and then invited us to come over and hang out with them a bit. So I couldn't pass that out. So we did that. And so this is sort of what I saw along the way. So this is actually a town called Nazaré, which is just north of Lisbon on the coast. And it's actually the surfing capital of Europe. It gets the largest waves of the Atlantic in Europe, and then there's people surf off it. It was actually kind of foggy and nobody was surfing when we were there. It's also January. So it wasn't, I mean, not that that stops people in Nova Scotia, but anyway. Um, so this is, and this big outlook and just an idea of the kind of things you see there. So being January, there wasn't a lot of things in bloom. It was mostly just green plants, but there were a few things. So the fumitory there is basically related to our corydalis, and there's different types of fumitory all over the place there. There's probably a dozen different kinds. It's pretty weedy. The wild clary is a kind of sage, actually. So the rest of the time we spent down at the Algarve, and Portugal actually used to be known, and back in medieval times, it was called Portugal and the Algarve. They were actually two territories that were kind of considered separate yet joined. And when you're in Portugal, when you go south from Lisbon, it's all fertile farmland, very flat and stuff. And then all of a sudden you come up these really rough hills and stuff. And that's where the Algarve starts. And so I did some trails there, inland there. And this is just some things I saw when I was walking along the trails. So this is just off the side of a farmer's field. There's all these paperwhite narcissus. And again, this is the middle of January. And the trees here are all carob trees, which are they're in the legume family. And they're the ones that have the little pods and the little nuts that you can make a chocolate-like substance out of. And oaks, there are a lot of different kinds of oaks in Portugal. They're all evergreen. And particularly in the south, there's a lot of the cork oak around, which are often been planted as well as wild. And almost all of them you see, and I don't know if you can tell here, the bottom part of the trunk is quite dark, quite black. That's because the bark has been removed to make wine corks, and there's all sorts of things they make out of cork in Portugal. It's one of their largest agricultural crops, apparently. I'm just going to go in here. And then in that general area, saw things like this. So the cistus is related to our frostweed that you find in sort of sandy areas like the dunes around Kingston and that, except it grows very shrubby here. And there's about a dozen different varieties probably growing there. And basically back in the 1930s, there was a dictator running Portugal at the time that decided to transform the country and cut down most of the forests, tried to create farms and things, which all failed. And then in the north part of the country, decided to replant everything with eucalyptus to be used for lumber, which never worked well.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
And so I didn't even bother taking a picture. There's just, in the northern part of Portugal, there's just acre after acre of eucalyptus. And of course, you've probably seen all these fires in Europe during the summer. Well, the eucalyptus just ignites like kerosene. So that's why they've been having these horrible fires in Portugal, is all the eucalyptus just going up in flames. But anyway, down here, there's very little eucalyptus, thank God. But the cistus instead is sort of taking over where all the old farms were and stuff. So they come in yellow and white and pink. There's very, very few in flower when I was there. It was too early. But it's apparently the whole hillside just get covered with this stuff. The rusty back fern is a type of asplenium, like a type of spleenwort. And I didn't bother putting the Latin names for things because in most of the cases, they wouldn't be ones you're familiar with anyway. I just kept with the common names. So this rusty back fern is just sort of a leathery spleenwort. And then down on the left here, the winged vetchling, that's basically like a sweet pea, except it has these tendrils on the end of the leaves and climbs up things with these tendrils, which I found odd. The lesser celandine, I saw that in Suzanne's slides. So this was just growing wild in a stream bed. It looked to me a lot like marsh marigold. No, the clethra, I think it's called. I'm not sure if I got that right. Anyway, but this is actually in the buttercup family. The celandine that we see growing wild, or it's an introduced plant here in Nova Scotia, is actually the poppy family. But they call them both celandine, but this one's in the buttercup family, and it has a large flower. I mean, it's a good sized plant, even though it's called lesser. The sea squill is really a kind of scilla, and the squill, like, except obviously poison, and I don't know what the flowers are like, but they're considerably taller than what we get here. The Gromwell is a type of borage. It's in the borage family. And I saw that in a number of places. It's a beautiful blue flower, these sort of big clumps of it. And lots of thistles, really prickly thistles all over the place. In fact, a lot of prickly plants in general. There's, because of all the history of grazing and stuff, those are the ones that survive. So there's two types of gorse there, and many, many other thorny plants that really restrict your movement around the place. The alligator plant is a type of calancho, which is in South America, which has sort of established itself there. And it's a type of plant where the little plants grow off the side of the leaves and then drop down and form new plants. So the flax is a nice linum type of plant. Like just saw the one plant when I was there. That's a true artichoke there in the upper right. That's just a dwarf version of it, but they grow wild. Borage grows wild. The asphodel is sort of like a yucca. It grows, long, thin, kind of stiff leaves with these nice flowers. And you just see them just growing on the roadside. That was right at the side of the road in the gravel, that one. Then the coastline. So the southern coast of Portugal is a Mediterranean climate, but it's not actually on the Mediterranean. The Strait of Gibraltar is in Spain. So this is actually this is on the Atlantic, but it's still a Mediterranean climate. And along a trail along those cliffs you saw there, these are the kind of things I saw. The Andalusian pipevine and the mousetail ericerum are both they're related to our wild ginger. They're also called birthwort, I think, sometimes. I thought the mousetail one I thought was a jack-in-the-pulpit type, but it's not. It's related to wild ginger. So again, knapweeds like we're familiar with, except this one is a much showier one. The sweet alyssum, which we see in our gardens, that just grows like a weed. Again, the creeping Gromwell that we saw earlier. The Iberian milk vetch is quite a sizable plant. I'd say that thing was close to 5 feet tall, very large, showy flowers. You see the cistus below it there. That's one of the very few ones I saw blooming. But you saw a lot of you tell they were growing all over the place. They just hadn't started to bloom. The stalk you're probably familiar with garden stalk. It's in the cabbage, like the brassica family. And it sort of grows like mustard grows here. You see it all over the place. And the rough briar is very similar to our cat briar. They're both smilax, except this one's even more vicious. It's a really nasty thorns, and it grows all over everything. And again, this is a place, arid landscape, kind of poor porous soils, and the plants grow accordingly. So the saltwort is related to our glasswort that just grows along the seashore, but this is a shrub, but very mealy looking and no real leaf. It doesn't look like leaves. The asparagus is a shrub that you wouldn't know was related to asparagus, other than you can sort of tell by the leaves, but very thorny. The juniper, a much closer, tighter leaf than our juniper. with the same kind of berries, and they use it a lot for flavoring. And the fan palm I found very similar to the palmettos you get in the southern US. It's that type of thing. That's the only native palm apparently in Portugal, but you see a lot of other ones that are introduced. And then the beaches. So
Severa.
what's that? So go a little further down the coast and it turns into beaches. So this is the town of Tavira, and there's a whole bar, out front of it that's got all the beach, which in the summer it'd be crowded with tourists. This place was empty in January. It was great. It was dirt cheap. The beaches were pretty much deserted, and you had the place yourself. And in the summer, when it's just horribly hot, apparently the beaches are just crammed full. You can hardly get anywhere or anything. So it was interesting going there this time of year. People just hadn't figured out that it was a good, and it was coolish, so you wear a light jacket, but it was really quite pleasant. The stone pine you see there, that's the pine that the pine nuts come from. And you see those sort of round, clumpy pines all over the place. And this is what was growing on the dunes. The Bermuda buttercup is actually an oxalis that is native to South Africa, despite the name. And it's a rampant weed all over Portugal. And it's one of these things that you try and cut it up and it'll just reproduce in the soil and that type of thing. But it's got a really nice yellow, it's quite about a 2-inch diameter flower. It's quite a nice looking flower, but it's quite rampant around the whole of Portugal. Another type of stalk, the coastal bugloss, clearly wasn't in bloom, but it has a very textured leaf, and that's similar to the bugloss we get here, I think. The bridal veil bloom is it's a pea-like flower on these, they just look like stems, or I guess they're long leaves, but there's no sign of a leaf to it. Bird's foot tree. So many of these shrubby plants are very similar to what are sort of flat, herbaceous plants where we are. So a bird's foot trefoil that we're accustomed to is growing like a shrub here. Same kind of flower, maybe a little larger, but a fuzzy leaf and very shrubby. The field marigold is calendula. That's our garden calendula, just growing wild. The sea knot grass is it's related to like lady's thumb, that persicaria, that kind of that family, but very leathery and again shrubby. Golden thistle is what's left of a plant that's similar to our sow thistle, except much more thorny. And then, various glassworts that are again related to the ones that we have here, except these are all shrubby. And they're edible. Like apparently you can buy spices in the stores where they will use them for, they have salt in them. So it's sort of a salty seasoning. Sea blight, again, a shrubby version of our sea blight. The crosswort is actually related to, it's related to galliums. So it's in that family. You wouldn't know it to look at it. The helichrysum and the yarrow are, again, shrubby versions of, the helichrysum is sort of type of everlasting. The yarrow is like ours, except you wouldn't know it to look at it. The silene is like a campion. The sea holly, eryngium, that's a garden plant here. Looks a bit like teasel. And again, a type of medic. We have the black medic here that grows along pathways.
Where looks like that.
What's that? Okay. So that's it for Portugal. So then the next part of my presentation is the trip we took down the Atlantic coastal plain Flora. And that was an interesting trip. I think we had about a half dozen participants, wasn't a huge crowd. But what was quite interesting about it is the weather. And this was the summer where everything flooded, and it was very flooded. And a lot of what we wanted to see was underwater. So, but it's, so for example, so Charlie and I went out to scout everything in the early part of August. This is August 5th. And so we wanted to see the Lofiola at Fancy Lake, which is just outside of Bridgewater. And almost all of it was dead or dying. It appeared to be. It was all, if you look in the lower left there, you can just see how brown it was. That was just almost all of it looked like that. You can see the flower clusters above. It looks like they'd started to bloom and then just the water level had just swamped them enough that they were just dying back. And there was a few, like I say, there's a few blooming and there was a few plants that looked healthier. You can see on the right. That was it. So we kind of canceled that part of the trip because and again, like between the 5th of August and when we actually went out, and I think the 22nd or so, when we started the trip, the water levels had all risen another foot and a half all everywhere. So all this stuff was even more underwater later in the year. Again, August, we went to Pond Hook Lake. I was looking for the Carolina redroot, and you'll see on the second on the left there, you can maybe see a little bit of a red root that was showing on one of them. None of them were in bloom. There was no sign of flower buds. They were kind of, they weren't huge. They looked like they were, doing healthy enough, but clearly with whether it was the high water levels, I suspect it was just the lack of sun because it had been so cloudy. Whatever it wasn't enough to encourage them to bloom. Virginia, so all that fern is Virginia chain fern there, and a little further down from Pond Hook Lake, there's a site where there's some Long's bulrush. Again, it wasn't showing any sign of blooming, and it wasn't, unless you knew to look for it, you wouldn't have really noticed it. So when we did it, so we kind of redesigned the tour a little bit, focused a little more on some of the coastal areas where things were still happening and where the flooding really didn't affect things much. So this is traveling between Plymouth and Tuscot and Morris Island here. And both in Plymouth and Morris Island, we saw the groundsel tree, which is a large, it's kind of between a tree and a shrub, but it's one of the very few plants that is in the aster family that's forming a large shrub like that. The other one actually being the marsh elder, which is the one you see on the right. And again, those are both considered imperiled plants. The salt marsh false foxglove. So you'll see the false foxglove, the Agalenus, it's fairly common across Nova Scotia, the version, the Agalenus Neo Scotia one, which has a little thicker leaf. In the salt marshes, where only a few things will grow, this very thin leaf version of it grows, and we actually saw one that had white flowers on top of it. So pleased with ourselves there. The Liliopsis is a plant you're sure to miss if you don't know to look for it. And again, it's part of the Atlantic coastal plains flora, only in a few places in Nova Scotia, and it grows in tidal estuaries. So it's half the time underwater, half the time out of the water. Very small. These leaves are probably less than an inch long. You can maybe see the little tufts where the flowers are there attached to it. And it just sort of carpets that sort of tidal area where the water comes up and down. And it's fairly common in the southern US, but it's, again, it's one of those plants that there's a big disjunct area, and then suddenly there's a bunch of it in Nova Scotia. And it's really only at Tuscot, and I think the La Have River, no, not the La Have, the Port Medway, I think is where the other lot of it is, and that's about it for Nova Scotia. And the three square bulrush is one that is again considered part of the Atlantic coastal plain flora. These beautiful, long, triangular stemmed bulrushes with these little heads on them. There's a whole meadow of it there. Then further down towards Barrington is Swains Road Bog, and then a little past that is Port Latour Bog. And we went to see the threadleaf sundew. When we were there on August 5th at Swains Road Bog, it was way underwater. Because of the fires in the area, they had created they had bulldozed a fire road which had blocked the drainage to the bog, and it was well underwater and had just started to break through and drain. And when we went back, I thought it was still underwater, but Jeff went out and actually did find some threadleaf sundew showing, and it was coming out of the bogs. These images are the same plant at Port Latour bog, the threadleaf sundew. And you can just barely see what was left of some flowers there on the bottom left one. I don't know if you can see a little bit of pink there, but they were pretty much past flowering, so we didn't really get a shot of that. Just outside of Swains Road Bog, across the street at the U-Haul where we parked, I happened to see that there's a huge colony of swamp loosestrife there, which is the native loosestrife. And it grows long, it's about, I don't know, 4 feet high and very arching long stems. I thought it was an annual, but apparently it's actually shrubby. It's a shrubby plant. And along the roadside leading into Swains Road Bog, it was all this area that had been bulldozed. All this blue toad flax was coming up. And another plant that is known to be at Swains Road Bog is the Elliott's goldenrod. We were too early to see it, but it's basically like a roughly goldenrod, except it's totally smooth. And it's a little fleshier, like a little larger leaf. I'm pretty sure that's what that is, but you know, I would love to have seen it in bloom just to confirm it. And then there's a pond that was just full of bladderwort, and Jeff helped identify this as the hidden fruit bladderwort, Utricularia geminiscapa, which is it's a smaller flower than the common vulgaris that we're used to. Up to Kedjimikujik Lake. And it gives you an idea of the flooding going on there. The slender golden top would be growing on the shore normally. So this is all flooded. We went to see the marsh pennywort, which is normally growing on the surface or above the surface. And you can see it was all way under, that was like 2 feet below the surface at least. I was wading out to my thighs in water there to get that picture. And the one on top was one actually broken off and is floating on the surface of the water. I didn't see any leaves that actually made to the top. And despite the name, there were no flowers. Our last stop on the trip was Mudflat, which we went to see for it's a wonderful colony of the sweet pepper bush, Plethora alnifolia. So on August 6th, Charlie and I went there and it was just starting to come out. And curiously, what I hadn't seen when I'd been there before was you'll see these long tubular leaves. There was these caterpillars that had formed like a lot of leaves, like hundreds of these leaves are all rolled up as tubes, and they were empty, like whatever it is had become a butterfly or moth and taken off and left these long leaves. And a lot of them had eaten the flower buds actually that were in there, but there's still plenty left. So it was just starting to bloom when we got there on the 6th of August. And then when we got back there on the 24th, it was just finishing up. So you'll see the middle one there. It's just the flowers were ending up. The thing that's great about that location, there's so many of those plants that you just get this waft of this amazing fragrance there. It's really quite magical. And then down below, saw there's bladder sedge growing there, and when Charlie and I were there earlier, we saw the dewdrop, which was in bloom. There weren't any blooms left when we got there on the 24th. And this is what we missed. So on the 5th, Charlie and I went up to Wilson's and Gilfillan Lakes looking for the Plymouth gentian and slender gold top. And basically these areas were about 1.5 feet underwater by the time we got back on the 23rd. So we didn't even bother to go out there because you couldn't even begin to get out. Like Charlie did a quick scout up there and you couldn't even begin to get out where these plants were. And I think when I was there, this very thin leaf plant with opposite leaves growing in the water, I think that's the Rose coreopsis, but there's no sign of flower buds. So I don't think it would have bloomed this year if I'm correct, even in my identification. So this is so I'm very curious, all these plants, like the same thing with Rexia, like there's huge colonies of Rexia that Charlie took out to see, and there's no sign of them. Like it's just, everything is flooded. So all these Atlantic coastal plain flora, wondering, what's going to happen to them? Like this, what's this flooding going to do to them? And curiously, I was talking, who was I talking? I think it's Sean Blaney. Somebody I was talking about it, who knows more than I, was saying, no, actually, this is the kind of thing they love, because this flooding will knock out their competition. These plants are going to come back quite well, but a lot of the competitors are going to be knocked out by this flooding. This is what they've evolved for. So, we will only know, I guess, when we head back. Okay, that's it.